It is such a pleasure to interview Dr. Rollin McCraty today, Director of Research at HeartMath Institute. Obviously, your output of research is quite extensive. What is your background?
Oh, my background?
Yes.
Well, my original background was communications engineering. I used to work for Motorola, and then started several of my own companies and kind of high-tech stuff, and which were fairly successful. And then about close to 30 years ago, met Doc Childre, who's the founder of HeartMath, and we had a resonance, and so I decided to sell my company I had at that time and help him, along with some others, found HeartMath. And then so second career, I guess, or third, I'm not sure how many, psychophysiology. So my Ph.D. is in psychophysiology. Was
there something that sort of compelled you into the science of the heart?
Well, it was really personal experience. That's why I chose to leave the company I had and sell that company and join up with Doc and, like I said, a couple handfuls of others. That's really the true answer. So prior to that, being an engineer, communication engineering and electrical engineering, always had an interest in electromagnetics from a very early age. I was the kind of kid that was building radio receivers and transmitters in school and getting in trouble with them, things like that. And so I always had that interest and was never really satisfied with our understandings or explanations, even in my communications career. So we know a lot about describing electromagnetic fields, and that's very brilliantly, but nobody could really ever answer, well, what are they actually? Nobody knew. So anyway, through some other esoteric readings, read some other things, and which led me into meditation, type of personal interest stuff. So I'd been a meditator for about 15 years, sincere at it, maybe not very good at it, I don't know, but I had some benefits out of it. And after meeting Doc Childre and his research and work on the heart as an entry point into consciousness, I tried it myself. And then I can honestly say in 3 months of the heart-focused practices made more personal gains in many different levels of life than I had in 15 years of meditative practices. And so I followed my own intuition, inner guidance, which was to sell that company. And found HeartMath.
And the rest is history.
Yeah, no regrets.
What are electromagnetic fields?
I don't have a clue. No, I mean, we know a lot about them and can describe them and their behavior, but at the real essence of what they actually are, I don't think anybody can really answer that. I mean, we have nice theories, flows of photons and so on, but that's really an unknown.
Can you define heart intelligence for me?
So what I'm suggesting here and what our research suggests is that the heart really is not just metaphorically the access point to that larger part of ourself. It is literally that. So heart intelligence is the flow of intuitive information from our large down through the energetic heart, down into the DNA, mind-brain systems.
And why is coherence important when it comes to matters of the heart?
So coherence is a term in physics and science that describes the harmonious relationships and order within the parts of a system. So to say that a system is coherent, it first of all implies that there has to be connection and communication between all the subparts, but that they're working together in a harmonious way that is energy efficient, and that the subparts of a system work together in a way that gives an output that's greater than the sum of the parts. So we use coherence in terms of we actually use it across 3 different levels of scale, what we would call personal coherence. And that's describing what's going on inside of our body, how harmonious is the activity in our nervous system. And across the different systems in the body is the immune system, the hormonal system, the nervous system, all working together in a harmonious state, for example, just to keep it simple. We also use coherence in the context of what we call social coherence. So that, the simplest way of saying it, describes how harmonious are the relationships and the connections within a group or a team, or it could be a community or a society or a country or the world. Okay, then our third kind of bucket, or where we use coherence, is what we call global coherence, and that gets into obviously social coherence is related to global coherence in terms of people getting along and working together harmoniously and so on. But we're also looking in the global coherence realm at the energetic communication and connections, not only between people around the Earth, but also with the Earth itself and the energetic systems of the Earth, the magnetic fields of the Earth.
Global coherence is something that has really inspired me. It's actually one of the main reasons I traveled all the way from the UK here to Boulder Creek, California, to speak to you today. Let's start with individual coherence and look at how emotional regulation can occur within my field or my electromagnetic output.
The best way to measure the coherence within our own body is actually reflected in the rhythms of the heart. Now that could be a whole day just talking about why that's true, but we'll keep it simple here. So going back in actually some of our earliest research in the 1990s, early 1990s, we started looking at physiological correlates of emotional states. In other words, what goes on in the body when you're feeling anger or anxiety and so on. But we were among some of the early pioneers, I think, of looking at positive emotions. That time in the scientific literature, there were maybe 3 or 4 studies or articles, research articles that looked at thousands on negative emotions, stress and anxiety, very few on positive emotions. Anyway, we were looking at positive emotions as well as stressful emotions and so on. In all the standard stuff that you would typically, in all the standard measures you would typically look at, brain waves, EEGs and skin conductance and ECGs and more. And what we found through those years of research was that it was actually the rhythms of the heart that was most reflective of a person's emotional state. And now that's called heart rate variability as the specific measure. And most people know what heart rate is, which is simply how many times does the heart beat in a minute. But in reality, in a healthy person, resilient person, our heart rate is changing with each and every heartbeat. So that time between each consecutive pair of heartbeats, you measure that, and that's what's called heart rate variability. And that's really important because without that, we wouldn't have a heart rhythm. So the heart is not a metronome, right? With the time between each heartbeat the same. You can look like that if you go visit a friend in a hospital or something, and the heart rate looks like a flat line, but it's not. That's all averaged out. And it's quite surprising how much variation there is beat to beat in our heart rate. And there's more to that story, but in addition to how much of it we have of this natural variability, and we have a lot of it when we're young and it gets less as we age, but at a deeper level, we look at the pattern of the rhythm, not just the how much of it we have. And it's the rhythm, the pattern of the rhythm that is the best measure of emotional state. So when someone's feeling anxious or frustrated or angry or impatient, the heart's rhythm is very kind of chaotic, jagged looking, and you plot it, and then we call that an incoherent rhythm. On the other hand, when we're feeling appreciation or kindness or care or compassion, but heartfelt feeling, not thinking, it doesn't work. It's the actual feeling of those emotional states. The heart shifts into a completely different mode that we call coherence. And that on a graph looks like a sine wave or smooth rolling hills kind of in the rhythm. Now for that to occur, there's a lot that has to be going on inside of our body to have that coherent rhythm. Because the heart actually is across many different systems in the body. For example, the heart's a hormonal gland, secretes hormones, has its own intrinsic nervous system called the heart brain, and it's connected with our brain up here in our head, more tightly connected through the nervous system than any other systems in the body. In fact, even in the fetal stage, they grow from the same tissue, the heart and brain, and are sort of very much connected. So all of these internal systems, the heart, brain, how it's communicating, the activity in our nervous system, have to be literally more synchronized. And for the body to work well, things need to be in sync for this little sine wave pattern to happen. So it's reflecting a lot of very deep fundamental improvements in the functioning of the body's internal systems when we have this sine wave pattern in our heart rhythm.
So heart coherence can then reflect physical health, emotional health?
I wouldn't say health that reflects, because the rhythms that I'm talking about now can change dramatically from moment to moment, depending on what we're feeling.
Exactly. So it all comes down to emotion?
No. No, not exactly. So, how do I say this? Let me back up then. So the amount of heart rate variability we have a lot of it when we're young. It gets less as we age. And it's almost a linear relationship. So it's a slow decline across age. In fact, the amount of variability, which is different than the pattern, right, is a good measure of aging. In fact, it's one of the best measures we know of. So we can measure how much HRV you have, or heart rate variability, and usually tell within a couple of years how old you are, if you're on a healthy trajectory. That, however, if you have a lot of stress that accumulates over, not because you had a bad week, but over time, you're starting a new business, going through a bad divorce, something that's really stressful, really taking a toll that depletes our inner systems, that will be reflected in low HRV. And that's not good, because we know now from many, many hundreds of studies actually now, that low heart rate variability for our age is an independent and very strong risk factor for future serious health problems. So in a way, it's a major, we can call it different things, resilience, health status, different things. So that's how HRV is related to health. One of the factors that can really deplete HRV is stress. But what is stress? When we really look under the hood, because stress is a word it's used around the world, but stress is almost always an emotion. So we say, you're stressing me out. What do we really mean? You're causing me to be frustrated, angry, upset, anxious, something. And this is really important because it's emotions that are the primary drivers of the activity in our body, not our thoughts. And this is really easy to see in the lab. You can have people wired up to all the machines we wire them up to, and have them count backwards by sevens, and all these things you do to mentally stress people. And thinking things, visualizing things. Not much really happens. Sure, we can measure changes, but they're very small and minor. But as soon as you trigger an emotion, as soon as you feel something, you get frustrated or anxious, or on the other hand, you activate a positive feeling. You really appreciate something, or a feeling of care. A lot of big changes happen really fast. So emotions drive the activity in our body. And it's why in our training programs, we really focus on helping people better self-regulate their emotions. Because that's really what's over. If we don't have the ability to self-regulate, and we're getting angry all the time or impatient, these types of things, that sets in motion at least 1,400 biochemical changes. It certainly changes the activity in our nervous system, takes us into that incoherent state, just inefficient. The brain doesn't work well. But we're adding a lot of taxes to our system, and those accumulate over time. So the key for most people to really improve in their health and sustain health over the long haul is becoming more first aware of what our emotional state is, our emotional diet, and learning how to self-regulate those emotions.
I've heard you say that emotion is the new frontier for humanity.
I think learning to regulate our emotions, not suppress, big difference, is certainly the new frontier in the next evolution of human consciousness. I think it's pretty easy you might have to think about this a little bit, but I would say it's the failure of self-regulation, especially attitudinal, emotional self-regulation, that underlies and plagues almost all the problems we have in modern society, certainly in our health, but also in our social systems.
You mentioned suppression of emotion. Is that really damaging?
Well, suppression of emotions doesn't really work. In essence, it's really disassociation. They're still going on. I mean, that's one of the problems, and I think in modern society is a lot of people are disassociated and aren't really aware of what they're feeling. They're still feeling them, and those emotions still have the same physiological playouts and effects. And oftentimes, by trying to suppress or ignore, deny, right, they still pop up, and they're still biasing and affecting our attitudes and behaviors nonetheless. And by suppressing or disassociating, we're really lacking self-awareness, first of all. And so many times somebody will do something or say something that triggers that stack of suppressed emotions, and then they pour out in a way that is disproportionate from the actual thing that happened, because we've stacked and suppressed and trigger them because we can't really suppress them. And another problem with trying to suppress an emotion is that if we say we're going to suppress and deny the certain uncomfortable feeling we may have, we're also cutting off our capacity to feel positive emotions.
Life can run.
It's just the way the brain works. I mean, if we're really disassociating from emotions, we disassociate from all of them. Yeah, you can't be selective about it.
Okay.
From our emotional system.
So if I don't want to feel angry, so I'm trying to put a lid on my anger, what am I putting a lid on? Joy?
Yeah, but we have to be careful here because I'm saying suppress.
Yes.
I think it's what you meant by put a lid on.
That is what I meant.
Yeah, because that can all put a lid on can be, you have to be somewhat careful, I think, here, because there is self-regulation of emotion, which is different than suppression.
What is the difference?
Some of this is grandma's wisdom. In a way, I call it, you have a small child, they fall down and scrape their knee or something. Once you make sure they're not hurt and blood's not squirting out and stuff. What's one of the first things you usually tell them to do? Breathe, right? Calm down. So that, in a way, that's self-regulating right there. It's not denying the feeling, but you're saying, okay, breathe. That's one of the most common first steps is breathing, taking slower, deeper breaths. And that works because the breathing is something we have conscious control over. That's part of it's called our autonomic nervous system. So a lot of people don't realize this, but the breathing actually modulates the rhythm of the heart. So when we take a few deep breaths, we're actually shifting the heart rhythm into a coherent rhythm. If we're taking it temporarily, a few short, longer, deeper breaths. And to complete this story out, at the simplest way I can say it, the heart actually sends more information through our nervous system to the brain, and the brain sends to the heart. And these neural signals coming up through our nerves to the brain go to every major brain center in the brain and have pretty important roles in modulating brain function and even our emotional experience. So by breathing, we're shifting ultimately the information being sent from the heart and body to the brain. And so the brain's interpreting that as everything's okay. That's just step one, because if breathing was all we had to do, the world wouldn't be in the state it's in. That'll take the amplitude out, say, of something where we've gotten triggered, we're angry or upset or overwhelmed, something. But then the next step is we can actually consciously shift the emotion. And one of the it's just so simple, but in a way, but you still have to be able to do it and practice it. And one of our techniques at HeartMath is called attitude breathing. So let's say you're feeling impatience, for example. So you start with what we call heart-focused breathing. Breathe through the center of your chest. Pretend you're breathing through this area. There's a reason for that focus that helps shift the rhythm of the heart. And once you get a few breath cycles of coherence, that's telling the brain, oh, okay, calm down, take some of the intensity out. Then the next step is to actually breathe a replacement attitude or feeling. So, okay, you can consciously breathe in a feeling of patience. And that helps you shift the actual emotional state to a positive. And then now you're setting in motion a very different set of biochemicals in our body that have a regenerative effect rather than a depleting effect.
So there is scientific proof that breath does help us self-regulate.
Yes, there's lots of studies, and just like I say, grandma's wisdom on breathing. And breathing is taught a lot of times when I'm doing a training, I'll ask the group, how many of you have been taught a breathing technique? Not every hand goes up, but a lot. You can just ask, well, in what context? And it's everything from scuba diving to if you're in law enforcement, shooting, right? Meditation or Lamaze class, the list goes on and on. And the reason for that is it works. Because again, it's a way we have conscious control. But it's only the first step, right? If it's just about breathing, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You mentioned the heart sending more messages to the brain than the brain does to the heart. Mm-hmm. I find that fascinating. Mm-hmm. And I've also read that the heart I can't remember the exact number, you can tell me, 5 times, 10 times, 100 times more electromagnetic than the brain. What is the exact data on that?
So the statement about the heart sends more information through the nervous system to the brain than the heart could sound like some big new discovery, right? It's not. This has actually been known since the late 1800s. It's basic anatomy. So this has just been largely forgotten and ignored. And even in healthcare and medicine, a lot of people don't know that. But it's, again, that's a fact, and basic anatomy has been known for many, many years. In fact, the original psychology, the founder of modern psychology, William James, was well aware of this, and this was well known in the 1800s. And it wasn't until the late 1920s that things kind of got shifted into another paradigm. But that's another story. So this neural information sent from the heart, it took a lot of labs around the world to work out all the mechanisms for this, but pretty well understood now. So in the late 1960s and 1970s, a lot of research in my field, psychophysiology, was looking at the interaction between heart and brain. And they discovered the early observations were that the activity of the heart was modulating brain function and affecting perception. And this created quite a stir back then, because the heart would even appear to be doing things ahead of what the brain needed, like it was anticipating what was going to happen next. And so this became the most famous hypothesis in psychophysiology, is that the heart modulates brain function and perception. They were proven right eventually and won all kinds of career awards. But you can imagine at the time that was very much against the paradigm of the day. And they introduced two terms to describe the observed effects that the heart had on brain function back in the early 70s. One was called cortical, top part of our brain where we get paid to go to work for, right? Inhibition. So that part of our brain's inhibited. Don't think clearly. Reaction times are slowed, coordination's not as good. A number of different effects were shown back then. And the other term was called cortical facilitation. In other words, you improve brain function, again, dependent upon the activity of the heart. And they had some proposed mechanisms and things, but it took many years, and a lot of different labs got involved, because this is pretty interesting. So now we know the mechanisms pretty well. And at the end of the day, it's pretty simple. But again, it took a lot of work to sort this out. So these ascending signals from the heart, they come first up to our brainstem, but very, very quickly, one synapse away, you could say, they go to many brain areas. But one in particular is called the thalamus. This is the very center of our brain, and it has many roles. And one of its important roles in this context is that it literally synchronizes the electrical activity of the brain. And the neurons in the brain have to be synchronized for us to be conscious. In fact, if you can't do that, you're in a coma. That's what happens. This is probably irrelevant, but where you're in a head injury, closed head injury, and those neural loops from the thalamus to the different parts of the brain, if they get damaged, the thalamus can't synchronize activity, and you can't wake up. You're in a coma. So that's at the most basic level. The brain has to be able to synchronize some electrical activity. But when we're in an incoherent rhythm, heart rhythm, those are the signals that go directly to the thalamus, and they basically interfere with or inhibit its capacity to synchronize the global electrical activity of the brain, hence the term cortical inhibition. So this is basically the explanation of why when we're angry at somebody or upset, you've probably never done this, but where we might blurt something out, say that thing that
I might have done.
Yeah. Well, I usually ask people for an honesty test and ask them how many times they've done it more than once with the same person around the very same issue. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's cortical inhibition. Just to take that a little step farther, this is easy to measure in the lab, and things like reaction times, coordination tasks, and so on. But the part of the brain that's most profoundly affected by the same process is the front part of our brain, called the frontal prefrontal cortex areas. And this is where actually one of my mentors, a guy named Carl Pribram, coined the term executive functions to describe what that part of our brain does. And the main capacity, a way to think of this, is foresight. This part of the brain gives us, which our beloved pets don't have. They have great memory of hindsight in often cases, what happened in the past, but the capacity of foresight is, as far as we know, uniquely human. The ability to know how our behaviors in the now are going to affect the future. Planning, goal setting, abstract thinking, right? Appreciation of a goal achieved. This is all part of that, what you'd call foresight. So not a good idea to hit the boss if you want to keep your job. right? These types of things. So those are pretty refined capacities and abilities, foresight and discrimination of appropriate behavior, abstract thinking. So the neural machinery, keep it simple, that underlies those capacities has to be well synchronized to perform optimally. So when we're in this incoherent state, those are the ones that get taken off really first and most profoundly. So hence cortical inhibition. We blurt out, say the thing we regret later when we're emotionally upset. On the other hand, when we're in a heart coherent state, that's the pattern now going to the thalamus. And it actually enhances the thalamus's ability to synchronize global electrical activity. So those same functions are enhanced more than our normal walking around. Well, so those same capacities are enhanced more than our normal walking around state when we're in a heart coherent state. So we have more options available, better capacity to self-regulate. Self-regulation ultimately comes from the frontal cortex. It allows us to inhibit ourselves so we don't do the thing, right? Impulse control, these types of things all comes from that. And this is why I think law enforcement and first responders really take to HeartMath so much, because it's really about getting ourselves in sync and optimizing our performance, not just about getting in a low heart rate state of relaxation, because coherence and incoherence is really independent of our heart rate. So most approaches to stress management that are taught are about relaxation. Now, and of course, that's an important skill when it's time to relax. But there are many times in life we need a higher heart rate. We have things to do. You have to take care of business where you need a higher heart rate, especially if you think of sports or first responders. But we want to be able to be in a composed state, right? Inner calm while still taking care of business in maybe a very fast way, right? But so it's really about getting ourselves in sync, getting ultimately the heart and brain in sync.
Yes, absolutely. You mentioned higher functioning then and peak performance.
Well, peak performance, that's fine, but I would really say what about sustained performance is really maybe more important than peak performance.
Even better. In that way, are our emotions the interface to, say, super functioning?
Yeah, there's kind of a typical way of thinking of consciousness is little c and big C consciousness. So if you ask most neuroscientists or neurologists about consciousness, it simply means we're awake, we're conscious. We go to sleep, we're unconscious. And that's typically what's called little c these days. Big C consciousness has to do with other theories and ideas of consciousness being something outside of the brain, functioning of the brain. And that can, a lot of different theories. In fact, there's whole conferences now on that type of consciousness. And depending upon who you ask, you'll get a different definition and a different understanding. And there really is no agreement yet on big C consciousness. This is a lot of the writings of the metaphysical writings and so on. For me, it's gotten simpler as I've gotten older and done more research. So as we become more personally coherent, and not just our heart rhythms, that's part of the process, right? We're developing more capacity to self-regulate, but it's self-regulating not because somebody said we should or because we're told in church or something we need to be nice people, but out of our own intelligence, because we're aligning more with the deeper core of who we really are and becoming more connected with that larger part of ourselves, the part we can't put under a microscope. Like you can't put a thought or an emotion or an intuition under a microscope and see it, but we know they exist. And that is something we can most certainly learn to align with more of that deeper part of ourself, which we call heart intelligence, right? Or our intuitive capacities. We've done a fair amount of research on intuition as well, but as we align with that deeper part of our larger self, just to keep it simple, when we self-regulate from there, that's really bringing in the power to self-regulate our emotions, attitudes, and behaviors. So it's not just about the emotions. A lot of times they're what need to be brought into management, right? From that other larger part of ourself that can finally manage the thoughts and emotions. And as we do that, we're coming from a much deeper, more aware part of ourself. So that we increase that flow of intuitive information. That's how I think of it. That does expand awareness. And I think in this case, consciousness. You can pretty much say that the two are the same. As we become more aware of our inner workings and who we really are, we also start becoming more aware of the world out here and our usually our actions, behaviors becomes more inclusive, not at the expense of self, but we start making choices that really consider the wholeness as we become more aware.
Is feeling then healing?
So healing is a big topic. And so when most people think of healing, they think of something physical, healing a broken bone or some type of injury or trauma, something like this to the physical body. But just as important, I think, as healing is on the mental, emotional levels. And for a lot of people, a lot of suffering isn't because of physical injury. It's really the emotional suffering that goes on. Depression, anxiety, or separation, loneliness. These are huge. In fact, loneliness is a stronger risk factor for heart disease than your cholesterol level, whether you smoke or not, your blood pressure, and these standard risk factors combined. Right? So as we practice, as people tend to practice more heart coherence, many studies have shown this now, and we're really aligning with that deeper part of ourselves. There can be serious healings that go on. And our not only physical body can be facilitated, that studies show that too, but I think more importantly is the mental emotional healing that goes on. And that is really reducing the separation to who we really are.
And I was referring to emotional healing.
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, but I need to state that. So in fact, I ask this question of most of the groups when I do talks and trainings and things. How many of you have had the experience maybe in the last day or two of where you were asked to do something or thought you should do something, but you just had a deeper inner sense that no, that's probably not the right thing to do or the right choice, or it could be the other way around, and about everybody raises their hand. I would suggest that this, if we look globally, the biggest source of stress that's kind of under the radar that most people aren't aware of yet is really that misalignment between, to keep it really simple, what the brain's saying and what the heart's saying. And the real path to increasing consciousness and awareness is really getting alignment between the heart and brain.
And how do emotions factor into that?
Yeah, so emotions is a complicated topic. I'm not trying to avoid it here. I'm just trying to think of simple ways to say this that are true to well, for one thing, the language of our inner guidance system of intuition is primarily emotions. So it's those inner feelings we have that's really our inner guidance. It's really the intuitions that I'm talking about, or usually come through the language of feelings. It feels right or doesn't feel right. But then, of course, in the larger sense of society, emotions are the biggest, I would say, health factor. And as we've talked about, because of hundreds of studies, numerous studies, lots show that it is the unregulated emotions, people who tend to be more angry, upset, anxious, that takes a serious toll on health, versus people who are more optimistic, have more appreciation, care, compassion in life. So those that are more positive, I think some of the studies suggest live about 8 years longer, for example.
What does emotional suppression look like in the lab?
Well, the tendency to be disassociated from our emotions, and some people might call that suppression, but suppression is really disassociating from them ultimately. We don't want to feel them, right? Typically shows up, if that goes on long enough, in reduced HRV, which is clearly a marker of reduced health and much greater risk for future health problems. And it's really interesting because some of the populations that we've worked with over the years, that typically male-dominated populations, whether it's law enforcement, things that's mostly male, tend to have this attitude of what are emotions. We don't want to talk about those, those things, arms closed. We don't deal with emotions. Tend to be some of the populations that get in the most trouble from their emotions by disassociating or suppressing them, because you really can't do it. So if we're trying to suppress or deny our anger, well, something usually triggers it, and then it outpours in a way that's disproportionate to the event. And We see so many examples of that, I think, in our media, where that's happening. In psychology, there's the teachings that emotions follow thought. And they can and do. And this is the approach of most what's called cognitive behavioral approaches, cognitive behavioral therapy and so on. And here the idea, it's called the ABC model, that we have a incoming sensory information, and it actually goes to the thalamus and then up to the cortex and then down to the amygdala and emotional centers for emotional detection. And that's all true. However, the amygdala, which is, you could think of as our emotional center, eavesdrops on the flow of information coming through the thalamus, which is where all sensory systems except smell go through before they get to the cortex. So in reality, the amygdala is eavesdropping on it and looking for, ultimately, it's a pattern match between stored historical memories and the current input. And when it gets a match, that will cause an output of the amygdala. And this happens before, or you get an unconscious emotion before the information even gets to the cortex. So in most of the times, emotions happening faster and before thought, and actually biasing the thought, or the thought's trying to justify what we already felt.
Right. The title of the documentary is Deconstructing Sentience. Mm-hmm. What does sentience mean to you?
So to me, it describes an animal or human's capacity to have sensory input and to have perceptions from that, and also have conscious and goal-directed behavior.
How important is it then to achieve self-regulation of our emotions?
Well, to me, a person's capacity of self-regulation is almost synonymous with maturity. So when we're small children, right, we have it kind of controls the size of our world, right? For me, for example, when I was a small child, the boundaries were the backyard. And then as I developed more maturity and which is really capacity to self-regulate, look before crossing the street and be home when you're told to be and so on. And that expanded the boundaries. And then that just continues throughout life. But self-regulation isn't something that just stops at a certain age, whereas for a lot of people, I think it does. It's especially as we learn to align more with our deeper inner guidance, which brings in another level of self-regulation that really opens, in my experience and what our research is showing, access to another, what you could think of, dimension of experience and textures. So it's something that can grow throughout a lifetime and really never ends.
We're looking at the impact that the individual can have on the state we see in our world today, environmental problems, ecological crises. Mm-hmm. How can I, as an individual, impact that?
I'm going to ramble a little bit on this one.
Go for it.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about individual coherence and the heart rhythm patterns. But every time the heart beats, it also creates a magnetic field. Now, I'm not talking about an aura here. I'm talking about a measurable magnetic field. How do I know this? Because we can measure it. So whenever you put electrodes on the body, you're measuring current flow, like it's done every day, all over the world, probably millions of times in doctors' offices. You're measuring the electrocardiogram, or you're putting electrodes on the brain and measuring the brain waves, the EEG. Whenever there's a current flow, basic physics, you create a magnetic field. And so every time the heart beats, it creates a magnetic field which radiates external to the body. Now, a good analogy here for people to understand is the same thing. This is the way our cell phones work. So we all know cell phones work inside, right? And it's an electromagnetic field produced by the phone that's carrying the information, your voice, the text message, picture, whatever. And the reason it works inside is because of the magnetic component. The electric and magnetic fields are quite different. Magnetic fields go right through things. So the magnetic field, in this case, generated by the heart, easily extends out into the space around us. And it's actually a toroidal shape, like a big donut that surrounds the body, a complex spiraling field. And we now know we can not only measure the magnetic field, but through spectral analysis techniques, almost the same thing I used to do when I worked for Motorola in communications engineering. We can decode the information being carried by the fields. And we know that the field is carrying information about our emotional state. In fact, it relates directly back, mathematically speaking, to the rhythms of the heart and the HRV patterns. So when we're feeling frustration or anger or anxiety, whatever, that's the information being carried by the field, just like our cell phone is carrying information. So the next phase in that type of research was to ask the question, well, we know that the heart is radiating these fields and carrying information about our emotional state, probably much more that we don't know yet. Does that affect others? Can it be detected by other systems? And that was actually quite easy to do, those experiments. So and this has all been published in peer-reviewed chapters and articles and so on, that our nervous systems are exquisitely sensitive to detecting the magnetic fields generated by other hearts. So, for example, we could measure, if we had us all wired up right now, probably your brainwaves synchronizing to my heart and vice versa as we have a conversation, and even our heart rhythm synchronizing. And that's what mediates that is the magnetic fields between people. So there's a subtle, maybe not so subtle, but a subtle energetic communication that's always going on between people. Another question I like to ask people, have you ever had a conversation, maybe today even, or recently, where somebody was saying something to you, but you felt something else, but there was a disconnect between what was being said and what you felt? And of course, most people have that experience. And what's really interesting is most people walk away from those conversations with what they felt more than what they heard. So that oftentimes, this is one of the big problems in communication, if we're not really aligned between what we're saying and what we're feeling. And for some people, it might be they just got some bad news before the conversation. That's nothing to do with you, but they're feeling that, worry or upset or whatever it is, but that's being communicated. So that's in our local field environment. And also experiments have now been done, but independently of us, and we've also done them, that show that if we're able to maintain our personal coherence, be in a heart coherent state, that creates a more coherent field environment, and that can actually have a lifting effect on others. In fact, it can help elevate them into a more coherent state. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it certainly makes an atmosphere that makes it easier for people to shift into more coherence and find their own balance. So when we're doing meditations together, or especially heart-focused meditations, when we're really increasing our heart coherence and the fields in our coherence, there can be a definite amplification effect when we do this together, certainly locally when you're in groups. In fact, one of the most common things we hear from people doing heart coherence training is how much easier it is to get into a coherent state and sustain it when they're in a group, when they're there with others, and you're creating a larger group field effect. Now, this is kind of moves us, so that's sort of the local explanation, and we know that's happening. Then we can also take it to the global level. So one of our hypotheses is that the Earth's magnetic field acts just like our cell phone carrier wave, and that especially hearts, but hearts and brains are coupled to the information we're radiating couples to the Earth's magnetic field. So it's now distributed globally. So what I'm really saying here is what we feel inside, whether we know it or not. Well, so what I'm saying, what we feel inside, whether we're self-aware of what we're feeling or not, doesn't just stay inside of us. It is carried by the magnetic fields of the heart externally and has a measurable effect on others. And then the next step of that is suggesting that it also couples to the Earth's magnetic field. So it's really like a giant computer. I call it the global information field that all humans are connected to, whether they know it or not. Now, it's wonderful when we come together in meditations together, because we can amplify the coherent signal and put a much stronger signal into the global field environment that makes it easier for others to wake up, to become more into coherence, to align with their deeper selves. But we also have to think about, well, what about all the other hours and times of a day when we're not together in a group, or we're not doing a meditation or a heart lock-in, as we call it? We're still coupled to the field. So one of the things I really encourage people to do is to take some moments throughout the day and pause. Do a spot check. What am I feeding the field? Is it frustration, anxiety, maybe feelings of overwhelm, impatience because I didn't get my to-do list done on time? Or how much of the ratio are we feeding the field kindness, compassion, care, appreciation? So it all counts. And at the end of the day, it's the totality of what all of humanity is feeding the field. But here's where coherence is really important, because coherence organizes noise. So when we come together in groups to meditate or have heartfelt intentions towards peace, then that coherence increases the coupling to the magnetic field, so we can put out a much clearer, stronger signal. In fact, the research would suggest even a few people in a highly coherent state can have more effectiveness than lots of people in an incoherent state. This is one of the benefits of the new Global Coherence app. It'll really help train us how to get into coherence at the group level and measure it.
What's happening here at HeartMath Institute in Boulder Creek when we're meditating globally? What are you going to be measuring here? What does that look like?
You're talking about with the app now?
With the app, like how are you actually collecting the data? Because we're going to be filming the Mom Mass Meditation in Manchester.
Right. So with the Global Coherence app, whether people have a sensor or not, we'll be able to track who's there participating. So we'll be able to track the number of people that are involved in the meditation and where they're located. So it'll be a great way of tracking that. And for those that do have a sensor or choose to get one, we'll actually be able to measure and track how much coherence, heart coherent energy they contribute to the global field. And that's really exciting because this has never been done before. So that's your answer there. So as part of the global coherence, continue rambling a little bit, if to do science, we have to measure things. So we've created, or still working on it, but creating what's called the Global Coherence Monitoring System. And these are exquisitely sensitive magnetometers that are designed to measure the resonant frequencies in the Earth's magnetic field. There's lots of magnetometers around the Earth for space weather and so on, but they're different than these because these are designed to measure the resonant frequencies, which are the moving fields. Now, the reason that's important, in fact, we published a number of studies in the last few years on this with some surprising results. But to give some background here, a little prop, but if you think of my fist as Earth, okay, so we have the geomagnetic field, which are the fields that go way out in the North and South Pole. So the geomagnetic field, this big toroidal shape, is what our compass tunes into, right? So that's a static field, like you might remember back in science class when you dump iron filings on a glass plate and you put a magnet under it, right? Kind of tap it and they line up. The iron filings, they lined up in lines, right? So those are field lines. That's what our flux lines are sometimes called. Those are real things. So it's the same with the Earth's magnetic field. Now, what's important to understand in this context is that when you pluck a magnetic field line, it vibrates, just like a guitar string. So the same thing's happening with Earth. So the field lines of Earth, just like a guitar, the tension and the length controls the frequency or the note. So they're very long in the case of Earth, so they're very low frequencies. 0.1 hertz is one of the primary resonant frequencies. And what's plucking the lines is the field lines is the solar wind rushing by. So you mean what Earth is turning and you got the sun turning and the solar wind rushing by at 1,000,000 miles per hour, plucking the field lines and they're vibrating. Now what's really fascinating here, and I think really important, is one of the primary resonant frequencies of Earth's magnetic field lines, as I said, 0.1 hertz. That's one cycle every 10 seconds. It's exactly the same frequency as the human heart rhythm when we're in a coherent state. Okay, so our hearts and Earth are vibrating at the same frequency. Now, there's another set of magnetic frequencies that are a completely different mechanism. Those are called Schumann resonances. And a lot of people get confused about these. So these are magnetic waves that are traveling around the Earth in all directions. They're there all the time. And they are magnetic waves that are trapped, if you will, between the surface of the Earth and the bottom of what's called the ionosphere. So the ionosphere you can think of as a soap bubble around the planet. It starts about 50 miles up and goes out to about 100 to 150 miles, depending upon seasons. So this is completely, Schumann resonances are completely determined by the physical geometry of this cavity between the Earth and the Schumann resonance. And there's 8 of them. And the first one is 7.8 hertz, 7.83 to be precise, and then 14 and so on. There's 8 of them. And this is kind of like the analogy most people have seen. You drop a rock in a pond of water, right? And it creates a wave that goes out. And if you drop another rock in at the right time, the waves add, right? And they're constructive. If you drop the rocks in at the wrong time, they interfere and this becomes choppy. The waves all go away. Same thing with the Schumann resonances. So they have to fit into the geometry. And if they do, they amplify and are globally, instead of these standing waves, or in other words, they're everywhere all the time. There's 8 of them. Again, all of them overlap human brainwave frequencies. Now, it's interesting that I don't know that it means anything or not, but Earth has the same ratios as humans in terms of the heart-brain magnetic fields. So the magnetic field produced by the heart is huge. We can measure it about 3 feet away from or about a meter from the body with sensitive magnetometers. Using the same instrument, you can measure a brainwave about an inch away. So the heart is obviously the big player, magnetically or energetically speaking. And the same with Earth. It's the field line resonances, which are the same as the heart, that are the big waves compared to the Schumann, which are tiny compared to the field line resonances. So it's just interesting that Earth and humans have the same ratios in terms of the magnetic field strength. The kind of the key point of all this is, if we transport back to science class when we were kids, most people got to play with tuning forks, right? And this is commonly talked about in terms of resonance. You tap on one tuning fork, you bang it, and the other one will magically start to vibrate with it. Now, in that case, if they're the same frequency. So what transfers the energy is, in our tuning forks, is air molecules. You vibrate the air, just like our sound waves are modulating the air molecules. Then it transfers that energy to the other tuning fork, if they're the same frequency. Works exactly the same way with magnetic waves, only you don't need the air molecules. So in this room right now around us, there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of cell phone calls or TV stations, radio stations, all going on. It's all here now. So if I get my phone out and we want to talk to somebody, well, how do you couple your phone to the information that's in the air, this invisible magnetic energy around us? You literally tune the receiver, in this case in your phone, to be resonant with the frequency of interest. And as soon as you do, boom, you transfer the energy and information from the magnetic field in, and we have our conversation. Just basic communication engineering. The point is, when two systems vibrate at the same frequency, you can transfer energy and information between them. So what we now know is our brains and hearts are vibrating at the same frequencies as the Earth's energetic systems. So we certainly have the basic physics to how we can transfer energy and information between humanity and the Earth's energetic systems, or magnetic systems.
Can I ask quickly about ley lines, those nodal points on the Earth?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, ley lines aren't something we can measure with magnetometers. They're usually dowsed and things. I'm not saying they're not real, but they're not a measurable phenomenon as far as I know.
Are we in the middle of a great awakening?
From my perspective, we are in the middle of a shift. A lot of people are talking about the planetary shift. And again, through my eyes, what the shift is really all about is an evolution of human consciousness. And that evolved, and what that's really about is integrating the heart's intelligence with the mind intelligence. So it's not about mind or heart, it's about the integration of the two. Because right now, the baseline of planetary consciousness is really mind-based, without really the deeper heart. So as the shift energies are occurring, we hear more and more about people's heart awakenings. And more than ever, you hear about people talking about the heart and the heart's intelligence. And that really is what it's about. Because as we access through the heart our larger self, we bring in that other dimension of intelligence integrated, and that really upgrades the mind to where it really surrenders to the heart. And then we become truly integrated, whole human beings.
Are the Schumann resonances actually increasing to, say, trigger this effect?
No.
Are we triggering it?
Neither.
Okay.
So, it really has nothing to do with magnetic fields, but directly it's our inner self. But so it seems like every couple of years something comes out about the Schumann resonances are increasing. I probably have some unique insight into this because we have a global monitoring system of the Schumann resonances. In fact, the only global, multi-site, calibrated, interconnected system in the world that I know of. And the Schumann resonances are exactly the same as they were when they were first measured in the early 1960s. 1959 was the first measurement, but from 1960 on. In fact, it's a good thing that they're not increasing, because the Schumann resonances are literally controlled or set by the geometry of the ionosphere to the Earth. And the ionosphere is critical for life on Earth, so it's not something we want radically changing. So, in fact, if they were changing, I think it would be very disruptive to humans, because again, our brainwaves and the human resonances are the same frequency. So, and there's actually studies that's showing that our brains do synchronize throughout moments every minute, especially when we're sleeping, with the human resonances, where we're transferring energy or really information back and forth. What a lot of people don't realize about human resonances, and there's 8 of them, right? 7.83 hertz, to be technically correct, is the first one. And then there's 14 and 20 and so on. And some of the second and third human resonances, for example, are actually stronger than the first one in terms of magnetic strength. And people that throw together little coils or things to go measure Schumann resonances often haven't done their homework, and they're usually not very sensitive. I mean, we have the most sensitive magnetometers in the world doing this, so we clearly see all of them, the different strengths, and we study them over years, and they do come and go in terms with seasonal variations in terms of the strength. So what some people, I think, what's happening is they'll see one of the higher Schumann resonances the first time because they don't have a very sensitive magnetometer. In fact, this last year, somebody was throwing this out on the internet. For the first time ever, 30 hertz was measured. I mean, we've been measuring it for years. Their magnetometer might have been the first time they saw it, but no. So there's a lot of nonsense that gets spread out on the internet about this.
Is what then affects the Earth's electromagnetic field that could be triggering an individual awakening? I
don't think anything. I don't think anything. I mean, I would not put the awakening of consciousness to do directly with the magnetic field of the Earth. I mean, it's yes, it's involved, but that ain't what's mediating all this. That's
so it's not from the outside in, is it? From the inside out?
Yeah. It's more about what are we feeding the field. Now, certainly when there's a solar flare, and you have a coronal mass ejection and the plasmas travel through space, that can cause it. Well, not only can it does cause disruptions in the Earth's magnetic field, the geomagnetic field. So it becomes disturbed. In fact, it's called magnetic field disturbance. And when that happens, it certainly affects humans to different degrees depending upon their sensitivity. So a lot of people have sleep problems, get up, kind of a saying we have here, you got up on the wrong side of the bed. I don't know if you have that in the UK or not. Yeah. Or something equivalent. So we're edgier. And a lot of studies have been done showing this. And there's more hospital admissions for a wide range of health issues, especially depression. People are more anxious and so on. But there's not that many days out of a year that the Earth's field is disturbed through a solar flare. It depends on the solar cycle. Yeah, some of our recent studies, in fact, I'll just talk a little bit about this. I'll ramble a bit then. So a lot of studies have looked at hospital admissions and magnetic field disturbance in particular. And there's a thing called KP index. That's a measure of magnetic field disturbance. Because that's the only thing they had. They didn't have our network of magnetometers that look at the resonant frequencies. And many studies have shown when the KP index is high, in other words, the field is disturbed, that you have admissions to hospitals for a wide range of illnesses, strokes and heart attacks and many, many other things, epileptic seizures and so on. So it's given the impression that the magnetic field could be harmful. But all of these types of studies, if you're looking at hospital admissions, are elderly people who already have an existing disease. So it can be the straw that broke the camel's back, the disturbance. But when we, in recent years, have been able to look in young, healthy populations, and we've been doing this by having them wear monitors that record their electrocardiogram and their HRV for, in some cases, months at a time, we see a very different picture emerging. So there are these environmental factors that appear to be very healthy for us. When they are increasing, our HRV is increased, we feel better and do better. And these are some surprising things, like Schumann resonance is one of them. Field line resonances, in other words, when the resonant frequencies in the Earth are increased, we tend to do better. And it's literally like it's an energy source for us. But also cosmic rays. So when the cosmic rays, which come from outside of our solar system, are increased, it actually has a large effect. So this may, in fact, have something to do with an influx of energy that can help increase collaborations and awareness and kind of a consciousness shift. Pioneer of what's called the field of helibiology, as it's now called, was a Russian astrophysicist called Alexander Chesovsky. And I often show his original data in my presentations. And he was drafted into World War I, and being an astrophysicist, right? He was kind of keeping one eye on solar activity and what the sun was doing. And it occurred to him, it looked like when there was solar flares and a lot of solar activity, that people down here on Earth just kind of got stupid, kind of crazy, compared to the quieter days. So I got him intrigued. So after the war, he did an exhaustive study of human history. And he went back as far as we had, at that time, they had solar cycle data for 1749. And basically created a graph that every year since 1749 to 1926, when he first published his work, the number of major human events that occurred on Earth that year. Simple graph, number of major human events each year across that time span. And you see this kind of wavy looking chart. And then he plotted the solar cycle right under it. You could lay the two over the top of each other. They're an exact match. It's really phenomenal. And so then later, another group also looked at the greatest periods of human flourishing globally, in societies that had no connection with each other, so through similar time periods. And it also matches. So it's not just the starts of wars and revolutions. It's also greatest periods of human flourishing that occurred during the peaks of the solar cycle, which is a 10.5 to 11-year cycle. And this was long before we knew anything about X-rays and solar radio flux and ultraviolet, right? The early 1920s. So, in fact, Chesovsky actually saw that human physiology would respond before the magnetic fields got disturbed. And he called it an anticipatory effect and said there has to be some unknown forces from the sun we don't know about yet. Now, we know about them now. And in fact, we can measure all this now. And we know that the sun literally puts out more energy during the peaks of the solar cycle. So our physiology is responding to this. So it's literally an energy influx, the way to think about it. So it gets down to how self-regulated are we, how mature are we on how we use that energy. So people that aren't well self-regulated or self-managed, you have this energy influx, again, all unconscious. They don't know what's going on. If you're a politician, you start wars, is what the data suggests. People get more traffic accidents, get a little edgier, more emotional disturbances and so on through these cycles. On the other hand, if we're more self-regulated, more mature, we use that energy influx to create new collaborations, invent new things, flourish, basically, in humanity. Now, this is becoming more and more important, I feel, as more and more people on the planet. Right? Because it's more, you get where I'm going with that.
I do. So you're saying, it can be polarized positive expression or polarized negative expression.
Well, it's energy.
Yeah.
It's energy. I'll give you another example. So more and more studies that in my collaboration groups are pointing to these things like the magnetics of the Earth, the Schumann resonance, field line resonances, solar radio. Well, see, the sun also radiates a radio wave, solar radio flux, it's called, 2.8 gigahertz. And then you have cosmic rays. These are all looking like they're energy sources and positive, depending on how we choose to use that energy. When they're increased, we have more energy. Kind of a neat little, I think, study that illustrated this, completely independent. And some of my collaborators came to the same conclusion. Was they were looking at hospital admissions at our medical school. We have a magnetometer, and this is in Lithuania, near them, and they've looked over a bunch of years now. And what they see is when the resonant frequencies, what they call the magnetic power, but we're talking the resonant frequencies, is high, there are fewer hospital admissions for elderly people with chronic disease, but there's more hospital admissions for young people. And when the magnetic field power is low, it's the opposite. There's significantly more hospital admissions in the elderly people for heart disease and strokes and so on, arrhythmias, and fewer for the young people. But the young people aren't being admitted because of disease. They're being admitted for accidents. See, so when the energy's up, they have more energy. They go do dumb things and get hurt. So more admissions. Make sense? So it's an energy source. It does make sense,
and it's more proof for me to go and actually get coherence so that I experience a positive expression of these solar bursts, for instance.
Yeah. So in this case, I'm not even talking about solar flares.
Right.
I'm just talking about the background magnetic fields of Earth. Now another example, I talked a little bit about how when we have a solar flare and it hits the magnetic field and disturbs it, that definitely has big effects globally for people. Again, different varying levels of sensitivity to that stuff. Some very sensitive, some, don't even know what's going on. The other example, going back to what I was talking about for the Global Coherence Initiative stuff, that we all feed the field. Another example, and people who pay attention have already observed this a lot of times, that you might wake up in the morning and you just feel edgy, out of sorts, or something's just not quite right. And not because you had a disagreement or an argument or anything, you just wake up that way. And then ask around, a lot of people might have felt the same way that day. It's pretty common. And then you turn on the news and you find out, there was some type of major event that triggered a lot of negative emotions. It could have been a terrorist attack, a school shooting, or a natural disaster, but something that created a lot of outpouring of emotion. So what kind of helps support what I'm saying about those. We're feeding those emotions to the global field, and we feel them and are affected by them, even if we're in a cave, in the Himalayas or wherever we are. It's still a global field effect.
How does a mass meditation make a contribution to global peace?
In a mass meditation, the more the better, because we're coming together with usually people that have a more loving, compassionate intent. I'm going to back up a little bit here, because you might know the Global Consciousness Project.
I do.
Yeah. So Roger Nelson's a good friend, and his favorite study that he's done is when he looked at, I think it was 180 formal events, as they call them, if you know his data. So he had them rated. So the events high in love and compassion, and then medium, all emotional stuff. So medium would be soccer games and Super Bowls, things like that. And then low, which would be your terrorist, responses after terror attacks and natural disasters and so on. What he found was those high in love and compassion had a significantly greater impact on the global field environment measured through the random number generator system than those in the other two categories. Pretty cool. So it really supports what I'm saying, is we're in a meditation, a mass meditation especially, because there's this amplification effect, which is non-linear, but amplified more when we're in coherence. So when people are more in love, so events that evoke love and compassion naturally bring people into more heart coherence. We know we can measure it. The more heart coherent we are, the more coherence in our field. So what his data is as an independent way of suggesting this is that when more people are in states of love and compassion, they're more coherent, and that is having a measurably greater effect in a global field environment measured through this completely different system or mechanism of the random number generator network.
Absolutely fascinating. So if someone at home were to feel like, I look around, I see environmental problems, ecological crises, how can I best make an impact on the state of the world today? How can I make a difference?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of people feel like that. It's just me. How can I possibly make a difference in this giant, global stress? Well, one way is that we all contribute equally to what we're feeding the field, unless we're able to practice coherence more, then we're maybe making a bigger impact, putting a positive signal into it. So I think as enough people wake up, and we are actually already starting to see this, especially when we come out with new technologies like the Global Coherence app, which really facilitates people connecting in heart-focused intention. You can be anywhere in the world. You don't necessarily have to be sitting like you and I are. You can be anywhere in the world at the same time, connecting in the heart and feeding more coherent energy, adding heart to the global field environment. And as people understand more the interaction or the feedback loop between humanity and the Earth's energetic systems, the more important it'll become and the more attention we'll pay to what we're feeding the field and the energetics. That really is important in helping lift the consciousness of the planet and humanity. But at the same time, we're here on Earth. We've got to get our hands kind of dirty. We have to get down here on Earth and actually do things. So what care is really, I think, love in action. When we actually get out and do things, roll our sleeves up. and start doing the kind of the common sense things that have to be done to really solve some of the world's problems. But some of these solutions are going to have to come through, I think, the heart intuition. And as we really make that alignment, then the solutions become more obvious.
Yes, it's the Einstein quote, you can't solve a problem on the same level of consciousness from which it was created.
Yeah.
You talked about emotional diet. Can you explain that and how it impacts consciousness?
Well, our emotional diet is, you could think of as the ratio of the types of emotions we process throughout a day or a week or a year. It doesn't really matter. We have one of our exercises in our training programs, we call it the emotional landscape, or the depletion to renewal grid, or the depletion to renewal grid in some cases. And it's basically a 4-quadrant diagram. So you've got high intensity emotions on the top, which have to do with our nervous system activity, and low intensity on the bottom of one axis. Then you've got what we call renewing emotions and depleting emotions, trying to take it out of good, bad. Because from one perspective, emotions are not good or bad, but in reality, the science shows us that they do have a depleting effect or a renewing effect. So you could say anger is, well, good because it tells us something, but it still depletes, for example. But if you think of that grid, so you have a high intensity depleting emotion might be like anger or hatred. A low intensity depleting emotion might be something like depression or resentment, something like that, depending on the strength. And on the other side of that grid, with your renewing emotions, you have things like appreciation, joy, enthusiasm. And then to your lower level, it might be things like peace, calm, those type of emotional experiences. So what we do in that exercise is people kind of think about the past few days and write down the emotions they've actually experienced for themselves and what grid they go in. And then you can kind of step back and look at your landscape or your emotional diet. Say, okay, well, where is the highest ratio of my emotional experience? Which quadrant am I in? Depleting or renewing? And then, okay, well, if I've got a little bit maybe over here, kind of top heavy or too many in the depleting kind, you can actually have them draw a little arrow, say, okay, I want more over here. So you just set a goal. If that makes sense. So then we have about 6 core HeartMath techniques that help people really shift their emotions. Again, it's not suppress, but we can take the energy behind an emotion, say frustration or irritation, and actually learn how to shift its frequency into the other side, into one of a patience or appreciation or calm. So that's when we're really truly managing our emotions rather than suppressing them. You're and really starting to manage your emotional diet, just like you can choose what your food diet might be. It takes some practice, but it's quite possible.
It really does.
Yeah.
Is actually managing my emotions a gateway to superconsciousness?
Yes, in a way. So as we learn how to have more appreciation, compassion, would be really a very high the emotion, these are frequencies. That does 2 things. It shifts the physiology into a more coherent state. In fact, in our research on intuition, we've actually shown through rigorous physiological studies that opens a channel between the heart and brain in terms of the heart intuition in a measurable way. So that we're increasing our inner guidance system, that flow of information from our higher selves, or larger self, as we call it here at HeartMath. You can call it whatever you want, your higher self, spirit, soul, but a larger self. So as we get more coherent through appreciating, caring, feeling more compassion, that's opening that channel. And that is, in fact, from my perspective, what indeed elevates consciousness. And so we become more aware.
I see. Going into non-local intuition, because you've already talked about intuition is absolutely possible. It's just tuning into that higher level of functioning. Does that mean that, say, psychic activity is real?
So there,
telepathy, etc.
To our research, and of course many, many others over many years, that suggest there are 3 types of intuition. And I think it helps to clarify this first. Otherwise it gets to be kind of confusing. So the first type is called implicit knowledge or implicit learning. And this is, most of the books on intuition are about this type. and it's safe to study in academia and so on because it has to do with the brain storing information unconsciously. So these be things we learned and forgot we learned or didn't know we learned just through experience. So the brain's, I won't go into a lot of detail here, pattern making is just looking for pattern matches between the past unconsciously stored information and current inputs. Right. So a classic example, this results in a thing called expert knowledge. So a classic example of this is a nurse who walks into a patient's room, says, oh, that patient's going to code in the next hour or so. And if you ask her, she can't tell you why. And a new nurse has no clue. What are you talking about? Right more often than wrong. But the problem with this type of intuition, it's really important, but it can also be wrong as much as it's right because it's using references to past information, and what's going on in the now may not be an exact match, or what happened in the past may not be the solution that works best now. I hope I'm making sense there.
Yeah.
I can give a lot more examples, but the second type we call energetic sensitivity. And this is our nervous system's capacity to detect and respond to real signals from the environment. So many examples here too. Empathy would be in this category. We talked earlier about how our hearts radiate magnetic fields that carry information. So it would be the capacity to feel what somebody else is feeling, for example. Studies have shown most people have had an experience of feeling like somebody's staring at them. You turn around and sure enough they are. Studies have actually shown that, but that's another type of energetic sensitivity. Some people are sensitive to earthquakes, can feel them coming. We now know we can measure changes in the Earth's magnetic field that precede earthquakes. So there's no question that the body is responsive to magnetic fields now, at least from ours and many other studies. So that's energetic sensitivity. Third type, which is what you're really asking about, we call non-local intuition. And these are the types of intuitions you can't explain away through the other two types. And they typically have to do with non-local, meaning in future time or across space that's farther than we could explain through some field interactions. So a lot of examples of this. The mother who knows their child's in distress and they're on the other side of the planet. Most mothers have had that experience. Or you think of somebody that comes up in your consciousness that you knew years ago, but you haven't thought of them in maybe 20 years or a long time. So it's not just a coincidence, but you start, oh yeah, I wonder what's happening to so-and-so. And then the phone rings or you get a letter from them, usually within a day or an hour or two, something like that. Those are kind of examples. In this category is also the type of intuition that I think where the real intuition is and this is also the type of intuition that is the kind I'm really talking about, our inner guidance system, type of intuition from our larger self, down through the energetic heart and down into the mind-brain DNA of the body. We've really been able to do experiments in all three types in the lab, but we focus more on the energetic sensitivity and the non-local. And through some very rigorous experiments, I won't bore you with all the details. It's all published. You can read the fine-tuned details, but a lot of careful thought goes into these experiments. We were able to show that the non-local type, the heart is the first to get the information, wherever that comes from. We can debate about that. And then the heart sends a measurably different neural signal to the brain, all before a future event happens. And then you get a body response. So it's heart, brain, body. So the gut gets the credit, the gut feeling, because that's an effector system, or the hair on the back of the neck for some people, that feeling. And it's about 80% accurate if we're looking at these types of experiments.
Are feelings the informants of our inner guidance system?
Well, in fact, almost all definitions of intuition talk about feeling. So it's pretty clear that that intuition is a feeling for most cases. Now, in other cases, it can be, inner voice, right? Inner images, things like that as well.
The vagus nerves and the autonomic nervous system, how do those then help us process our feelings? Can you just briefly explain that? Well,
the vagus nerves, which are the primary nerves of the parasympathetic nervous system, in addition to their basic role in functioning, right, which are enormous, also underlie what's called the social engagement system. So it's the vagus that allows us to self-regulate. So in other words, we're not, as humans, we're not restricted or limited is a better word to fight or flight responses like a lot of people would have us believe. It's through the vagus or the parasympathetic system that we self-regulate, self-inhibit. So it has an inhibiting effect, slows heart rate. So that's one of its important roles. The vagus is also one of the main channels of the communication between the heart and the brain. So these are two nerves that come down through the front of the body. They're very large nerves, thousands of neural fibers. And depending upon which estimate, 80 if we're conservative, most people estimate that 90% of the neural fibers in the vagus nerve are afferent or is sending information, carrying information from the body to the brain. And most of those come from the heart, cardiovascular system. So we've been focused in psychology on the 10% for years. I mean, the vagus is what carries information back and forth between the brain to all the glands and organs in the thoracic cavity, heart being the primary source of them, but also the gut and throat and all the different glands and organs. But they, in terms of the heart, in fact, the textbooks are wrong, still wrong about all of this. And we know out of the field of neurocardiology that all of the neural fibers coming down from the brain to the heart actually connect to the intrinsic cardiac nervous system or the heart brain. None of them go directly to the tissues of the heart or the SA node and so on, like the textbooks still stay, even though it's been known for many years now that's not right.
Do you think it's important to marry science and spirituality? Yes.
I mean, the kind of work that a lot of people are doing, both in that we're doing and many in other groups as well, but even especially in the quantum physics groups, science and spirituality have been joined. I mean, I don't know that they really ever were separate other than our human perception sometimes.
For some people, myself included, the science has helped me get to access certain levels of spirituality because it helped me believe.
And that's the thing that I hear most from people, ordinary people that read our stuff or hear lectures and things that I give is thank you for your research because you have confirmed what I already knew or believed to be true. And now you've given me the confidence to follow my heart or whatever that might be.
My sentiments exactly. So speaking from
from the
HeartMath Institute, your goals, your mission statements, that kind of thing, if you just kind of want to wrap up.
Yeah.
In terms of everything we've talked about, and if there's anything you think I missed.
Yeah.
Hopefully not. I think we covered most of it quite thoroughly.
I think so too. Good. I mean, we could talk for days and still.
Oh my gosh, I know.
The big game is follow your heart. In terms of the planetary shift and what it's really all about, in waking up, it is really people learning how to follow their heart and their inner guidance from their heart. And that's really why HeartMath was founded and why it exists, is to develop simple tools, techniques, and also technologies that facilitate that process. It's really all about learning to follow the heart, and we can certainly help facilitate that by giving people simple tools and technologies that really help them open the heart and learn how to follow the heart's intuitive guidance.
And it's totally possible to achieve emotional mastery or self-regulation.
Absolutely.
And heart coherence.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Dr. Rollin McCraty, I really appreciate it. And I'm sure you're hungry. Lunch.
I am, but I'm not starved. It's fine.